The stormy London sky wept as Lady Eleanor Pembroke trudged through the shadowy alleys, her silk slippers ruined by the muddy cobblestones. The distant toll of St. Paul's Cathedral marked the hour, 11. Too late for a lady to wander alone, too early to assume the safety of anonymity. Her heart pounded with the weight of her decision. Leaving Pembroke Hall wasn't merely an act of rebellion, it was an act of survival. Her mother's ultimatum still echoed in her ears. "You will marry Lord Hargrave by month's end, or you shall leave this house forever." Her mother's icy stare and tightly clasped hands had been a cruel reminder of their precarious situation. Pembroke Hall, once vibrant and teeming with life, was a shadow of its former glory. The roof leaked, the servants had dwindled to 2 loyal retainers, and the creditors' notices stacked high on her father's desk told the tale of a family on the brink of ruin. Eleanor had always known her marriage would be more contract than love match, but Lord Hargrave was a line she could not cross. His lecherous glances and whispered threats made her skin crawl. "No," she whispered to the cold wind. "I would rather live penniless than submit to him." Clutching a small satchel that held all she could carry, a second gown, a pair of gloves, and a treasured volume of poetry, Eleanor pressed onward. Her destination was Westbridge Manor, an estate she had only heard of in whispers. The Duke of Westbridge, Alexander Hawthorne, was reputed to be a man of unyielding principles. But Eleanor did not care about the Duke's character. She cared only about the vacancy in his household staff, a position she had overheard a tavern maid discussing during her hasty escape. If she could secure the job, she could vanish into the folds of servitude, unrecognizable to the prying eyes of the ton. As the rain poured harder, Eleanor pulled her hood tighter, her breath visible in the frigid air. It wasn't just the weather or her circumstances that chilled her, it was the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "Late, is she? Typical of the lot these days?" grumbled Mrs. Havisham as she paced the kitchen, her stout figure and ever-present apron making her look more a general than a housekeeper. "Mark my words, Edwards. She'll be another one of those city girls who thinks she can laze about in a nobleman's house." "Mrs. Havisham," came the measured voice of Mr. Edwards, the butler. "Her Grace has requested your efficiency, not your commentary." Mrs. Havisham shot him a glare, but was silenced by the sound of the kitchen door creaking open. A drenched Eleanor stood on the threshold, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her hood dripping water onto the tiled floor. "You're late," Mrs. Havisham barked, though her sharp eyes softened at the sight of the girl's bedraggled state. "Well, don't just stand there. Come in before you catch your death." Eleanor stepped inside, grateful for the warmth emanating from the massive hearth. The kitchen smelled of baking bread and simmering stew, a far cry from the meager rations she had consumed during her journey. "Name? Ellen," she replied, the alias slipping easily from her lips. Mrs. Havisham squinted at her. "And where did you serve before?" "A small household in Bath," Eleanor lied smoothly, knowing enough of the city's servant culture to make her story plausible. Mrs. Havisham sniffed. "We'll see if you can manage. The East Wing will be yours to keep. That means the library, the study, and the sitting room. You'll also answer to me, and only me. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor replied, lowering her gaze. "Good. Now, get changed and report to the East Wing before sunrise." As Eleanor was shown to the cramped servants' quarters, she felt a glimmer of relief. She had made it this far. All she had to do was keep her head down and avoid suspicion. Alexander Hawthorne, the Duke of Westbridge, rose with the dawn. His mornings began with precision, a solitary ride through the estate, followed by a review of his correspondence. Today, however, his thoughts were clouded by his mother's incessant demands. "You cannot delay this any longer," she had said just yesterday. "Lady Abigail is perfect, wealthy, well-connected, and dutiful. What more could you want?" What more, indeed? He could not fault Lady Abigail. She was beautiful, intelligent, and possessed a poise that society adored. Yet Alexander found himself unmoved by her charms. Duty. It was a word that had defined his life since he inherited the title at 23. His father's untimely death had thrust him into the role of Duke far earlier than expected. The weight of the title had shaped him into a man of discipline and order, leaving little room for frivolity. "Your Grace?" Alexander glanced up to see Mr. Edwards at the door. "The new maid has arrived. She's been assigned to the East Wing." "Very well," Alexander replied, dismissing the thought. A new servant was of little consequence in the grand scheme of his world, or so he thought. The wind howled through the narrow streets of London as Lady Eleanor Pembroke slipped through the shadows. Her worn cloak clutched tightly around her shoulders. Rain pattered softly at first, then grew heavier, soaking her to the bone. But Eleanor hardly noticed. The biting chill of the November night was nothing compared to the cold dread in her heart. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she darted around a corner, the hem of her cloak catching on the jagged edge of a cobblestone. She stumbled, barely catching herself before falling. A quick glance over her shoulder confirmed what she already knew. No one was following her. For now. Pembroke Hall had long been her prison, its decaying grandeur a mockery of the family's former glory. Its once proud columns and gilded archways now crumbled with age, just as her father's health and fortune had crumbled under the weight of years. She had grown used to their genteel poverty, finding solace in quiet moments in the gardens or the dusty library. But the arrival of Lord Hargrave had changed everything. The memory of him still made her stomach churn. He had arrived at Pembroke Hall in a carriage emblazoned with his family crest, his appearance every bit as repulsive as the stories that preceded him. His beady eyes had lingered far too long on her, his smile oily and predatory. "She's comely enough," he had said to her father, as though she weren't standing mere feet away, "and at least she knows her place." Eleanor's mother had seen Hargrave as salvation. Eleanor saw him as her ruin. "You will marry him," her mother had commanded, her tone brooking no argument. "Do you think you have the luxury of choice, Eleanor? A man like Lord Hargrave is the best offer you'll ever receive." Eleanor had fled the drawing room that night, retreating to the sanctuary of her chamber. The thought of becoming Lord Hargrave's wife, a man who viewed her as little more than an acquisition, was unbearable. Her freedom was all she had left, and so she had made her choice. The rain intensified, soaking her through as she emerged onto a broader street. The gas lamps lining the road cast flickering pools of light, and the distant rumble of carriage wheels reminded her of the world she was leaving behind. The world of ballrooms, silk gowns, and endless scrutiny. She pulled her hood lower as she approached the outskirts of the city. Her destination was clear in her mind: Westbridge Manor, a place she had only heard of in passing. The Duke of Westbridge, Alexander Hawthorne, was known throughout London for his impeccable reputation and strict adherence to duty. Rumors of his exacting standards and austere personality had painted him as both formidable and unapproachable. It was perfect. A duke's household was the last place anyone would think to look for Lady Eleanor Pembroke. Disguised as a servant, she could vanish into the background, leaving behind her past and her title. As the rain-soaked countryside began to unfold before her, Eleanor felt a twinge of doubt. What if they didn't hire her? What if someone recognized her? The plan, hastily formed and dependent on chance, suddenly seemed reckless. But there was no turning back now. The towering silhouette of Westbridge Manor appeared on the horizon, its sprawling estate illuminated faintly by the moonlight breaking through the clouds. Eleanor paused, her chest tightening. The sheer scale of the manor was intimidating, its stone facade a testament to centuries of wealth and power. Gathering her courage, she pressed forward. The heavy oak doors of Westbridge Manor creaked open, revealing a stout woman with a sharp gaze and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Yes?" the woman demanded, her voice clipped. I'm here about the position," Eleanor stammered, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. The woman's eyes narrowed as she scanned Eleanor from head to toe. Her clothes were plain but damp and muddied, lending authenticity to the guise of a desperate servant. "You're late," the woman barked, though she stepped aside to let her in. "Come along then. Mrs. Havisham doesn't wait on stragglers." Eleanor followed the woman through the grand entry hall, her eyes darting to take in the splendor around her. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of a chandelier, and the scent of polished wood and beeswax filled the air. It was a world apart from the crumbling corridors of Pembroke Hall. She was led to a warm, bustling kitchen where a fire roared in the hearth and several servants bustled about, preparing for the morning ahead. At the center of it all was Mrs. Havisham, a formidable woman with an apron tied tightly around her ample waist. "So you're the new girl," Mrs. Havisham said, her tone skeptical. "You don't look like much." "I can work hard, ma'am," Eleanor replied, lowering her gaze to appear meek. "We'll see about that. You'll be responsible for the East Wing. That means the library, study, and the Duke's private sitting room. Keep it clean and keep it quiet. The Duke is not a man to tolerate disturbances." "Yes, ma'am. And one more thing," Mrs. Havisham added, fixing Eleanor with a stern look. "Stay out of trouble. The last thing this household needs is another maid causing a scandal." Eleanor nodded, though her heart raced. She had entered the Duke's domain, but the hardest part was yet to come. As she was led to the servants' quarters, she felt a strange mix of fear and determination. She was no longer Lady Eleanor Pembroke. Here she was Ellen, a simple maid with nothing to her name but her will to survive. Tomorrow, her new life would begin. Morning broke over Westbridge Manor with the crisp stillness that only an estate of its grandeur could command. The vast grounds stretched endlessly, blanketed by dew that shimmered under the first rays of sunlight. Inside the manor, the servants moved in a well-practiced rhythm, preparing for another day under the exacting gaze of the Duke of Westbridge. In his private study, Alexander Hawthorne stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the estate. His silhouette was imposing, broad shoulders, a sharp jawline, and a presence that commanded authority without effort. The Duke was not a man to be trifled with, and those in his employ knew it well. The morning ride through his lands had been uneventful but satisfying. Alexander valued routine. It was the foundation upon which his life had been built. As the eldest son of the late Duke of Westbridge, he had inherited the title at the tender age of 23 after his father's sudden passing. Responsibility had shaped him, and duty had defined him. "Your Grace," came the measured voice of Mr. Edwards the butler. Alexander turned, his expression unreadable. "The household is ready for your inspection," Edwards continued, "and the new maid assigned to the East Wing has arrived. Mrs. Havisham has already briefed her on her duties." "Good," Alexander replied, his voice low and steady. "See that she adjusts quickly. I won't tolerate idleness." "Of course, Your Grace." Alexander returned his gaze to the window, his thoughts drifting. His mother's words from the previous evening still lingered in his mind. "Alexander, you cannot delay this any longer," the Duchess of Westbridge had said, her voice laced with exasperation. "A man in your position must marry, and Lady Abigail is a perfect match. Her family is respectable, her dowry substantial, and her manners impeccable. What more could you possibly require?" He had said nothing, allowing her tirade to wash over him like a familiar tide. This was not the first time his mother had broached the subject, nor would it be the last. But Alexander knew the truth. Lady Abigail, for all her qualities, stirred nothing in him. He had grown tired of the relentless matchmaking, the balls, and the endless parade of eligible young women who saw him as nothing more than a title to be won. Yet, as Duke, he knew his duty to marry and produce an heir was paramount. Alexander sighed, his gaze falling to the rolling hills in the distance. For now, he would put such thoughts aside. There was work to be done, and his responsibilities would not wait for idle musings. Eleanor had spent the morning acquainting herself with the East Wing. The library was grand, with towering shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that spoke of generations of wealth and learning. The Duke's study, though off-limits to her, exuded an air of authority, with its dark wood furnishings and meticulous organization. By midday, she had settled into a rhythm. Cleaning and dusting were menial tasks, but they provided her with a sense of purpose. Each stroke of the feather duster and sweep of the broom allowed her to focus on something other than the uncertainty of her future. Door opened abruptly. Eleanor froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing in the doorway was the Duke of Westbridge himself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Alexander's piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and Eleanor felt as though he could see straight through her. His presence was overwhelming, an air of quiet command that made her feel small and exposed. "You are the new maid," he said, his tone even but firm. "Yes, Your Grace," Eleanor managed, lowering her gaze in what she hoped was a convincing display of humility. Alexander stepped further into the room, his movements deliberate. "Your name? Ellen, Your Grace?" He studied her for a moment longer, and Eleanor resisted the urge to fidget under his scrutiny. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsing her responses and perfecting her accent to match that of a... But standing before the Duke, she felt the weight of his gaze as though it could unravel her secrets. "Well, Ellen," he said finally, "see that you perform your duties diligently. I expect nothing less." "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. With a curt nod, Alexander turned and left the room, leaving Eleanor to release the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. As the door closed behind him, she allowed herself a moment to collect her thoughts. The encounter had been brief, but it had shaken her. The Duke was every bit as formidable as she had imagined, and she could not afford to draw his attention again. But even as she returned to her work, she couldn't shake the memory of his gaze. There had been something in his eyes, curiosity perhaps, or something deeper. She dismissed the thought quickly. Whatever the Duke's thoughts, they were of no consequence to her. She was here to survive, nothing more. The servants' quarters buzzed with quiet chatter that evening as the household staff gathered for their meal. Eleanor kept to herself, listening as the others spoke about the latest news and gossip. "Did you hear about Lady Abigail?" one of the maids said, her voice low but conspiratorial. "They say the Duchess is pushing the match harder than ever." "The Duke won't have her," another servant chimed in. "He's too particular." "He's particular about everything," Mrs. Havisham interjected, her tone sharp, "which is why you'd all do well to keep your noses out of his affairs and focus on your work." Eleanor remained silent, though her ears pricked at the mention of Lady Abigail. She had no interest in the Duke's personal life, but the discussion reminded her of the delicate balance she needed to maintain. One misstep could expose her, and she could not afford to let curiosity or anything else distract her. As the evening wore on, Eleanor retired to her small room, her body aching from the day's. She had survived her first day at Westbridge Manor, but the road ahead was long. Closing her eyes, she resolved to keep her head down and avoid any further encounters with the Duke. But as sleep claimed her, the memory of his penetrating gaze lingered in her mind, unbidden and unsettling. The morning sun rose slowly, casting a golden light over the sprawling grounds of Westbridge Manor. Inside, the manor buzzed with the quiet efficiency of servants going about their tasks. Alexander Hawthorne, the Duke of Westbridge, sat in his private study, poring over correspondence that demanded his attention. The matters of the estate were never-ending. Leases to review, tenant disputes to settle, and investments to monitor. For years, this work had filled his days, leaving little room for distraction. But today, his mind strayed, uncharacteristically unsettled. It was the maid, Ellen. She had been a fleeting presence, a mere shadow in his sitting room, yet there was something about her that lingered in his thoughts. Perhaps it was her stillness, the way she seemed to disappear into the space, or perhaps it was her eyes. Though she had kept them downcast in deference, he had caught a brief glimpse, a striking shade of green, vibrant against the pale hue of her skin. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. It was unusual for a servant to capture his notice, even briefly. His household ran like clockwork, with Mrs. Havisham and Mr. Edwards ensuring that everything was in its proper place. Yet Ellen's presence had stirred something, a faint curiosity he couldn't quite place. Shaking off the thought, he returned to his correspondence. There was no time for idle distractions. Eleanor rose before dawn, her body sore from the previous day's work. The servants' quarters were quiet, the others still sleeping as she dressed in her plain gown and tied her hair into a neat bun. Today, she would redouble her efforts to blend into the background. The east wing was silent as she began her work, dusting shelves and arranging furniture with meticulous care. Each movement was deliberate, every task executed with precision. She had resolved to leave nothing to chance, But as she entered the library, she was startled to find the Duke already there. He sat in a high-backed chair near the window, a book open on his lap. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating his sharp features. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Your Grace," Eleanor murmured, dropping into a quick curtsy. "You're early," he remarked, his tone neutral. "I prefer to start the day promptly," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "An admirable trait," he said, closing the book and setting it aside. Eleanor busied herself with her cleaning, acutely aware of his presence. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft swish of her duster. "What is your name again?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Ellen, your Grace." "Ellen," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. "You're new to service." The statement made her pause. How much had he noticed in their brief interactions? She chose her words carefully. "Yes, Your Grace. I served in a small household before this." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on her a moment longer. "You seem different from the others." Eleanor's heart raced. Was he suspicious? Had she slipped somehow? "I hope my work meets your expectations, Your Grace," she said, keeping her tone humble. "So far it does," he replied, rising from his chair. His towering frame seemed even more imposing in the confined space of the library. "But time will tell." With that, he left the room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her hands trembling. The encounter had been brief, yet it had left her shaken. She could not afford his attention, not even the faintest trace of it. Meanwhile, in the grand drawing room, the Duchess of Westbridge was deep in conversation with Lady Abigail Montrose. The young woman sat demurely on the chaise, her blonde curls perfectly arranged, and her pale blue gown a vision of refinement. "You must be patient, Abigail," the Duchess said, pouring tea into delicate china cups. "Alexander can be. Difficult at times, but he is a man of duty. He will come around." "I hope so, Your Grace," Abigail replied, her voice sweet but tinged with frustration. "I fear he finds me lacking." "Nonsense," the Duchess said firmly. "You are everything he could want in a wife, beautiful, accomplished, and from an impeccable family. He simply needs time to see it." Abigail sipped her tea, her delicate features betraying none of her thoughts. But inwardly, she fumed. She had spent months cultivating the Duke's favor, attending every ball and dinner party where he might appear, yet he remained frustratingly distant, polite but indifferent. She would not let him slip through her fingers. The title of Duchess of Westbridge was too great a prize to forfeit. As the days passed, Eleanor settled into her routine, careful to avoid any further encounters with the Duke. But despite her best efforts, she found herself crossing his path more often than she liked. Each time, his gaze lingered just a moment too long, as though he were trying to decipher a puzzle. And each time, Eleanor felt her carefully constructed facade threaten to crack. It wasn't just the Duke she had to worry about. The other servants had begun to notice her as well. "She's too quiet," one of the maids whispered one evening as they scrubbed the kitchen floors. "Keeps to herself too much." "Maybe she's hiding something," another chimed in, her tone conspiratorial. Eleanor ignored the gossip, focusing on her work. But she couldn't shake the feeling that her time was running out. And then, one evening, everything changed. Eleanor was returning to her quarters after a long day when she heard voices coming from the Duke's study. She paused, her curiosity piqued despite herself. The door was ajar, and the flickering light of a fire cast shadows on the walls. "You cannot avoid this forever, Alexander," the Duchess's voice said sharply. "I will marry when I choose," the Duke replied, his tone colder than Eleanor had ever heard it. "Not when it suits your ambitions." "This is not about ambition," the Duchess retorted. "It is about securing the future of this family. Lady Abigail is—" "I've heard enough," Alexander cut in. "Good night, Mother." The sound of approaching footsteps jolted Eleanor into action. She darted into an alcove, her heart pounding as the Duke strode past, his expression thunderous. For a moment she considered returning to her quarters and forgetting what she had overheard. But something about the exchange lingered in her mind. It seemed she was not the only one at Westbridge Manor keeping secrets. The morning after the tense midnight encounter, Eleanor found herself scrubbing the marble floors of the East Wing corridor. She focused intently on her task, the rhythmic motion of the brush against the stone grounding her swirling thoughts. The words she had overheard between the Duke and the Duchess replayed in her mind. She knew she should not care about the Duke's personal affairs, but she couldn't help feeling a strange kinship with him. He too seemed trapped, his life dictated by the expectations of others. It was a feeling she knew all too well. "Ellen," came Mrs. Haversham's sharp voice, snapping Eleanor out of her reverie. The housekeeper loomed over her, her apron spotless as ever. "The library is a mess. His Grace was in there late last night, and it needs to be tidied before Lady Abigail arrives." Eleanor's stomach sank. "Lady Abigail?" "Yes, Lady Abigail Montrose," Mrs. Haversham said, her tone curt. "She's visiting for tea this afternoon. Now, get to it." Suppressing her unease, Eleanor rose to her feet and hurried toward the library. She had heard the name enough in the servants' quarters to know that Lady Abigail was a frequent guest at the manor and a favorite of the Duchess. As she entered the library, she was struck by the disarray. Books lay scattered across the table, and a glass of brandy sat forgotten on the sideboard. Eleanor moved swiftly, replacing the books on the shelves and wiping down the polished surfaces. She was placing the final book back in its spot when the door opened behind her. She turned, expecting to see another servant, but froze when she saw the Duke. Alexander stepped inside, his dark gaze sweeping over her before landing on the books she had just arranged. "You're thorough," he remarked, his voice low. "Thank you, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, lowering her gaze. He walked toward the shelves, his hands clasped behind his back. "Do you read?" The question caught her off guard. Yes, Your Grace. A little." "What do you read?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to answer. Servants were not expected to engage in intellectual pursuits, and admitting her love of literature might draw unwanted attention. "Whatever is at hand, Your Grace," she said carefully. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. An evasive answer. "I suppose I shall have to guess." Eleanor said nothing, her heart pounding in her chest. Alexander pulled a book from the shelf and glanced at the spine. "Shakespeare," he mused. "Do you prefer comedies or tragedies?" "Tragedies, Your Grace," she admitted before she could stop herself. "Interesting." He returned the book to the shelf and turned to face her fully. "Most prefer the light-hearted tales. What draws you to tragedy?" Eleanor swallowed hard, her mind racing. She could not tell him the truth, that she saw herself in the doomed heroines, trapped by fate and circumstance. "Perhaps it is because they show life as it truly is," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's gaze lingered on her, and for a moment the space between them seemed to shrink. But then he straightened, his expression once again composed. "You may go," he said, his tone dismissive. Eleanor curtsied and left the room, her thoughts a tangle of confusion and unease. The Duke's questions had felt too personal, as though he were trying to unravel something she did not want him to see. The grand drawing room was awash in sunlight as Lady Abigail Montrose arrived, her gown a delicate shade of lavender and her golden curls perfectly coiffed. She greeted the Duchess with a dazzling smile, though her eyes scanned the room, searching for the Duke. Alexander entered moments later, his expression polite but distant. He bowed slightly to Lady Abigail, who curtsied in return. "Lady Abigail," he said, his tone neutral. "A pleasure, as always." "Your Grace," she replied, her voice lilting. "It has been far too long since my last visit." The Duchess beamed, her satisfaction evident as she poured tea for her guests. "Abigail was just telling me about the charity gala she hosted last month," she said. "Such a credit to her family, don't you agree, Alexander?" "Indeed," Alexander replied, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. As the conversation continued, Alexander found his attention drifting. Abigail was charming and accomplished, yet she stirred nothing in him. His thoughts, unbidden, returned to the maid in the library, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the unexpected depth of her words. "Alexander," the Duchess said, her tone sharp. He blinked, realizing he had missed something. "Forgive me, Mother. What were you saying?" "I was suggesting that you and Abigail take a walk in the gardens," she said, her smile tight. Alexander nodded, though the prospect filled him with reluctance. "Of course." As he escorted Lady Abigail through the manicured hedges and blooming flowers, he made polite conversation, asking about her family and her latest endeavors. But his thoughts remained elsewhere, drawn inexplicably to the green-eyed maid who had slipped past his defenses without even trying. That evening, Eleanor sat on the edge of her narrow cot, staring at the small notebook in her hands. It was the only personal item she had brought with her, its pages filled with sketches and snippets of poetry. She thought of the Duke, his questions lingering in her mind. Why had he noticed her? And why did his attention leave her feeling both exhilarated and terrified? Eleanor closed the notebook and placed it beneath her pillow. She could not allow herself to dwell on him. He was the Duke of Westbridge, a man far removed from her world. Yet, as she lay in the darkness, the memory of his voice and the intensity of his gaze refused to fade. The following week at Westbridge Manor brought an undercurrent of change that no one could quite name. The air seemed charged, as though something unseen lingered on the cusp of revelation. Eleanor worked tirelessly to avoid attention, yet it felt as though eyes were always on her, some curious, others suspicious. And then there was the Duke. Alexander's presence loomed larger each day, his shadow crossing her path at the most unexpected moments. She caught fleeting glimpses of him in the halls or on the grounds, his gaze sharp and searching. Though he said little, his silence spoke volumes. Eleanor had made every effort to fade into the background, yet she felt herself being drawn closer to him in ways she couldn't control. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows over the manicured gardens. Eleanor had been sent to gather fresh lavender for the kitchens, and had taken care to keep to the less traveled paths. The gardens, with their lush greenery and bursts of color, were her favorite place on the estate, a rare escape from the oppressive confines of her role. She was crouched near a lavender bush when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. "Ellen!" The voice was unmistakable. She froze, her hands gripping the shears tightly before she forced herself to rise and turn. The Duke stood a few paces away, his dark coat a stark contrast against the vibrant blooms surrounding him. The sunlight caught in his hair, softening his features in a way that made her breath catch. "Your Grace," she said, dipping into a curtsy. He approached slowly, his gaze fixed on her. "Do you often escape to the gardens?" "I was sent to collect lavender for the kitchens," she replied, holding up the small basket she carried. "Efficient and resourceful," he remarked, his tone unreadable. "Yet you seem to find more here than merely herbs." Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to respond. The truth was too dangerous, yet lying to him felt equally perilous. "The gardens are peaceful, Your Grace," she said finally. "It is easy to forget one's burdens here." Alexander's expression softened, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. A rare sentiment for someone in service. Most would consider their burdens unavoidable. Eleanor lowered her gaze, her heart racing. "Perhaps it is foolish to think otherwise." "Not foolish," he said, his voice quieter now. "Merely unusual." Silence fell between them, heavy and charged. Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze, but she dared not meet it. "Ellen," he said after a moment, his tone shifting, "you have been at Westbridge Manor for only a short time, yet you seem different from the others." Her pulse quickened. "I do not mean to stand out, Your Grace." "Yet you do," he said, stepping closer. "I cannot quite place it, but there is something about you." Eleanor's grip on the basket tightened. She needed to end this conversation before it went too far. "If I have given offense, Your Grace, I beg your pardon. It was not my intention." "You have not offended me," he said, his voice steady, "but you have intrigued me." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching voices broke the spell. Eleanor turned to see Lady Abigail and the Duchess rounding the corner, their laughter cutting through the quiet. Alexander stepped back, his expression hardening as though a mask had fallen into place. "Good day, Ellen," he said curtly before walking away, his stride purposeful as he moved to intercept his mother and Lady Abigail. Eleanor watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she should feel relieved that the moment had passed, yet a part of her felt its loss acutely. As Alexander approached, Abigail's smile faltered. She had seen the maid, Ellen, was it? Standing in the gardens, her basket in hand and a guilty expression on her face. But more troubling was the way the Duke had looked at her. Abigail prided herself on her ability to read people, and there had been something in Alexander's demeanor that set her on edge. He had been too close, too intent, as though the maid mattered more than she should. "Alexander," the Duchess said, her voice bright, "we were just speaking of the upcoming ball at Thornfield. You will, of course, be attending." "I will consider it," he replied, his tone distracted. "Consider it?" Abigail said with a light laugh, though her eyes remained sharp. "Surely you cannot miss it. Lord and Lady Harrington would be most offended." "I am certain they will survive my absence," Alexander said, his voice cool. Abigail's smile tightened. She'd worked too hard to secure her place as the Duchess's favored choice to let some lowly maid jeopardize her plans. The days that followed were tense. The servants whispered of Lady Abigail's icy demeanor and the Duke's unusual mood. Eleanor kept her head down, pouring herself into her work and avoiding any place where she might encounter him, but avoidance did little to dull her thoughts. She replayed their conversation in the gardens over and over, his words echoing in her mind. What did he see in her that he found so intriguing? And why did the answer scare her more than anything else? Eleanor knew she was treading dangerous ground. The Duke's attention, however fleeting, could bring nothing but trouble. Yet despite her resolve, she felt the pull of something undeniable, something that made her question whether her carefully constructed walls could hold. The evening air at Westbridge Manor hung heavy with the scent of impending rain. The skies were darkening, and the wind carried a faint chill, whispering through the trees like an omen. Inside the manor, preparations were underway for an impromptu dinner arranged by the Duchess. Eleanor worked quietly in the servants' quarters, polishing silverware with methodical precision. The quiet hum of activity around her provided a fragile sense of normalcy, but beneath the surface, her nerves were frayed. The memory of her conversation with the Duke in the gardens haunted her, a constant reminder of how precarious her position had become. "Ellen!" Mrs. Haversham's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and authoritative. Eleanor looked up to see the housekeeper standing in the doorway, her expression stern. "Yes, Mrs. Havisham? The Duchess has requested additional hands in the dining room. You'll serve tonight." Eleanor's heart sank. Though she had avoided the public-facing roles as much as possible, tonight there would be no escape. Nodding quickly, she rose and followed the housekeeper to the grand dining hall. The dining room was a spectacle of elegance. The polished mahogany table gleamed under the warm glow of the crystal chandelier, set with the finest china and gleaming silverware. The room was alive with the sound of polite conversation, the clink of glasses, and the rustle of silk gowns. Eleanor moved silently among the guests, her tray steady as she refilled wine glasses and cleared plates. She kept her eyes lowered, careful not to draw attention, but she could feel his presence. The Duke sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed yet commanding. Lady Abigail occupied the seat to his right, her voice lilting as she engaged him in conversation. Yet Eleanor noticed the subtle tension in his responses, the way his gaze occasionally drifted, as though his thoughts were elsewhere. It was during one of these moments that their eyes met. Eleanor had been reaching for a glass near his end of the table when she felt the weight of his gaze. She looked up instinctively, and their eyes locked. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed to still, the clamor of the dinner fading into silence. The intensity of his stare sent a shiver down her spine. It was as though he could see past the facade she had so carefully constructed, peeling back the layers to uncover the secrets she fought to keep hidden. "Ellen!" The sharp whisper jolted her back to reality. Mrs. Havisham was glaring at her from across the room, her expression a mix of annoyance and warning. Flustered, Eleanor quickly turned away and resumed her work, her heart pounding. Abigail had not missed the exchange. Though brief, it had been enough to confirm her growing suspicion. The maid, Ellen, was not as inconspicuous as she pretended to be. Abigail watched the girl with narrowed eyes, taking in the way she moved, graceful but restrained, as though she were holding herself back. There was something about her that didn't fit, something that felt out of place. "She's rather pretty for a maid, don't you think?" Abigail murmured to the Duchess, her tone light but pointed. The Duchess followed Abigail's gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly as they landed on Eleanor. "Perhaps," she said dismissively, "but hardly worth noticing. She is new and still learning her place." Abigail said, her gaze lingering on Eleanor. "I wonder if the Duke has noticed her." The Duchess stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Nonsense," she said firmly. "Alexander has far more important concerns than a servant girl." But Abigail wasn't so sure. Later that evening, as the guests retired to the drawing room for brandy and cigars, Eleanor made her way back to the kitchens. Her steps were hurried, her mind racing with the events of the evening. She needed a moment to compose herself, to push away the memory of the Duke's gaze and the unsettling awareness it had sparked, but as she turned the corner into an empty corridor, she nearly collided with him. "Your Grace," she gasped, stepping back quickly and dipping into a curtsy. Apologies. I did not see." "Ellen," he interrupted, his voice low. She froze, her heart pounding. He rarely addressed her so directly, and the sound of her name on his lips sent a thrill of panic through her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone softening. Yes, Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling. "Forgive me for my clumsiness." "You were not clumsy," he said, his gaze intense. "But you seem troubled." Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to respond. Every instinct told her to retreat, to deflect his attention, but the sincerity in his voice disarmed her, leaving her feeling exposed. "I am fine, Your Grace," she said finally, though the words felt hollow. "I should return to the kitchens." She moved to step past him, but he reached out, his hand lightly brushing her arm. The touch was brief but electric, sending a jolt through her. "Ellen," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "there is something about you, something I cannot ignore." She looked up at him then, her green eyes wide with a mixture of fear and longing. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the space between them charged with unspoken words. But before either of them could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. They broke apart and Eleanor stepped back, her cheeks flushed. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said hurriedly, dipping into a curtsy before disappearing into the shadows. As Eleanor fled, Alexander stood in the corridor, his emotions a whirlwind of confusion and frustration. He had never felt this way before, this inexplicable pull toward someone so far removed from his world. But he could no longer deny it. Ellen was no ordinary maid. Meanwhile, Lady Abigail, having witnessed the scene from the far end of the corridor, clenched her fists. Her suspicions were confirmed, and fury burned within her. She would not allow some lowly servant to threaten her plans. The storm brewing at Westbridge Manor was no longer just a metaphor. Secrets were unraveling, tensions were mounting, and the boundaries between duty and desire were beginning to blur. The heavy rain that had threatened all evening finally arrived, drumming against the windows of Westbridge Manor with relentless force. The storm outside mirrored the unrest within, though the grand halls remained outwardly serene, their silence broken only by the occasional echo of footsteps. Eleanor sat in the dimly lit servants' quarters, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She had finished her tasks for the day, but her mind offered no reprieve. The memory of the Duke's words and the look in his eyes was a relentless loop that refused to fade. Her solitude was interrupted by the creak of the door. She looked up to see Clara, one of the younger maids, slipping inside. The girl's brown eyes were wide with excitement, and she clutched a damp shawl around her shoulders. "Ellen," Clara whispered, her voice low but urgent. "You won't believe what I've just heard." Eleanor's stomach tightened. Gossip among the staff was a constant, but lately it seemed to carry sharper edges, the whispers laced with suspicion. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Lady Abigail," Clara said, pulling a stool closer. "She's furious. I overheard her speaking to the Duchess after dinner. She said she's certain the Duke is interested in someone below his station." Eleanor's grip on her cup tightened. "Surely she doesn't mean she didn't say who," Clara interrupted. But her tone was icy. She even hinted that she might involve the staff. questioning whether anyone had seen something improper. Eleanor's heart sank. It was one thing to endure Lady Abigail's disdain from a distance, but if the Duchess or the staff began to scrutinize her every move, her position would become untenable. Clara leaned in closer. "Be careful, Ellen. If Lady Abigail thinks you're a threat, she'll make your life miserable." Eleanor nodded, her mind racing. She thanked Clara for the warning, though no words could ease the growing weight of her fears. The storm showed no sign of abating as Alexander stood by the window of his study, staring out into the darkness. A glass of brandy sat untouched on the desk behind him, the amber liquid glowing faintly in the lamplight. His conversation with Eleanor replayed in his mind, her wide green eyes and trembling voice haunting him. He had seen fear in her expression, but also something else, something he couldn't name but which drew him to her all the same. He was a duke, bound by duty and tradition. His life was meant to serve the estate, the title, and the expectations of his family. Yet Eleanor had unsettled him in a way that no one else ever had. The knock at the door startled him. "Come in," he said, turning toward the sound. Lady Abigail entered, her lavender gown trailing elegantly behind her. Her expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed a sharpness that Alexander had come to recognize. "Abigail," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "what brings you here at this hour?" "I couldn't sleep," she replied smoothly, glancing around the study before settling her gaze on him. "I thought I might find you here. The storm has everyone restless." Alexander gestured toward the chair opposite his desk, though he did not sit himself. Abigail took the seat gracefully, folding her hands in her lap. "I worry about you, Alexander," she said after a moment, her tone soft. "You seem distracted lately." "I have many responsibilities," he replied evenly. "Distraction is inevitable." "Of course," Abigail said, her lips curving into a faint smile. "But I wonder if it's more than that. You've been spending quite a bit of time in the company of the servants." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. "I oversee the running of my estate, Abigail. That includes ensuring the staff performs their duties." "Perhaps," she said, tilting her head. "But I can't help noticing a certain maid who seems to have caught your attention." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I trust, Abigail," he said slowly, "that you are not questioning my judgment." "Never," she replied quickly, though her smile faltered. "But others might. Your reputation, Alexander, is everything. A single misstep could invite scandal." Alexander's jaw tightened. He knew what she was implying, and it stoked a flicker of anger within him. But before he could respond, Abigail rose from her seat. "I only wish to protect you," she said softly, her voice laced with sincerity. "Good night, Alexander." She left the study, her skirts whispering against the floor. Alexander turned back to the window, the tension in his chest refusing to abate. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the grounds of Westbridge Manor glistening with rain. Eleanor was up before dawn, her nerves raw as she prepared for another day. She had resolved to keep her head down, to avoid any situation that might draw attention to her. But as she carried a tray of linens toward the laundry, she felt the weight of someone's gaze. Turning a corner, she came face to face with Lady Abigail. "Ellen, isn't it?" Abigail said, her voice smooth but cold. Eleanor curtsied quickly. "Yes, my lady. I've been hearing your name quite a bit lately," Abigail continued, her eyes sharp as they swept over Eleanor. "It seems you've made quite an impression since arriving at Westbridge." Eleanor's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I only seek to do my work well, my lady." "Indeed," Abigail said, her lips curving into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "But let me give you a word of advice. Know your place. Ambition, no matter how subtle, is a dangerous thing for someone like you." The veiled threat was clear, and Eleanor lowered her gaze. "Yes, my lady." Abigail lingered for a moment longer before sweeping past her, leaving Eleanor trembling in her wake. As the days passed, the tension in the manor grew palpable. Lady Abigail's presence became more oppressive, her sharp eyes watching Eleanor's every move. The staff whispered of her growing obsession with uncovering the source of the Duke's distraction, while Eleanor tried desperately to remain invisible. But fate seemed determined to keep throwing her into Alexander's path. Each encounter was a delicate dance, fraught with unspoken words and barely restrained emotions. And with each passing day, the walls around Eleanor's carefully guarded secret began to crumble. The days following Lady Abigail's veiled threat were some of the most trying Eleanor had endured since arriving at Westbridge Manor. Every step felt scrutinized, every glance a potential dagger aimed at unearthing her secret. She kept to the shadows, taking on the most menial of tasks in the hopes of avoiding notice. But the manor had its own plans. The Duke's presence was inescapable. Whether she encountered him in the library as he browsed the collection, in the stables as he inspected the horses, or in the halls during his passing conversations with staff, Eleanor found her carefully controlled world tilting further with each stolen moment. The tension between them grew, unspoken but undeniable. His gaze lingered too long, his questions about her well-being too pointed, and though she knew she should fear his attention, Eleanor found herself anticipating it, drawn to him like a moth to the flame. Alexander stood in his study, the fire crackling in the hearth casting shadows across his face. A decanter of brandy sat untouched on the side table, but his focus was fixed on the letter in his hand. It was from an old friend, Lord Greystone, who was known for his sharp wit and sharper instincts. Greystone had attended a dinner in London a few months ago, where he claimed to have heard whispers of a scandal involving a young woman from a respectable family who had mysteriously disappeared. The details were vague, but something about the description tugged at Alexander's memory. Could it be Eleanor? Was she more than she appeared? He set the letter aside and leaned back in his chair, his thoughts churning. If Eleanor was hiding something, what could it be, and why did he care so deeply? That evening, unable to sleep, Eleanor found herself wandering the halls of the manor. The storm had passed, but the unease in her heart lingered like an unwelcome guest. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders as she moved through the dimly lit corridors, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor. She was startled when she turned a corner and nearly collided with Alexander. "Your Grace," she gasped, stepping back quickly. "Ellen," he said, his voice low but steady. "What are you doing wandering the halls at this hour?" I couldn't sleep," she stammered, lowering her gaze. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone." "You're not disturbing me," he said, his tone softening. "But you shouldn't be out alone." She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I'll return to my quarters." He stepped closer, and the warmth of his presence enveloped her. "Wait!" Eleanor froze, her heart pounding as he reached out and gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. The intensity in his eyes stole her breath, and for a moment the world around them faded. "Who are you, Ellen?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "I feel as though you're hiding something." Her pulse quickened, and she stepped back, breaking the connection. "I am no one, Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling. "Just a servant." "You are not just anything," he replied firmly. "There is more to you than you let on." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Please, Your Grace, don't ask me questions I cannot answer." The vulnerability in her voice cut through him, and he took a step back, his expression conflicted. "Very well," he said finally, "but know this, I will not let anyone harm you." Eleanor blinked, startled by his words. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the dim corridor, her heart heavy with emotions she couldn't name. Unbeknownst to them, Lady Abigail had not retired for the evening as she claimed. She had been wandering the manor herself, her curiosity piqued by Eleanor's odd behavior and Alexander's sudden protectiveness. From the shadows, she had witnessed their exchange. A slow, satisfied smile spread across her face as she watched the Duke walk away, leaving Eleanor standing alone. It was as she had suspected. There was something between them, something that could ruin Alexander's reputation and, by extension, her carefully laid plans. Abigail returned to her chambers with a renewed determination. She would uncover Eleanor's secret, and when she did, she would ensure the girl was cast out of Westbridge Manor. And perhaps, Abigail thought, she could use the scandal to cement her own place as the Duchess. The following morning, Eleanor woke to an unusual summons. Mrs. Havisham appeared at her door. her expression unreadable, as she instructed Eleanor to report to the Duchess's parlor immediately. Eleanor's stomach churned. She could think of no reason for the Duchess to summon her, and the possibilities filled her with dread. She arrived at the parlor to find the Duchess seated on a velvet settee, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Lady Abigail stood by the window, her expression smug. "Ellen," the Duchess said, her tone cool, "we have some concerns regarding your presence here at Westbridge." Eleanor's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. "Concerns, my lady?" Abigail stepped forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You've caught the attention of more than a few people, Ellen, and not in the way a servant should. We feel it's only fair to ask, where exactly do you come from?" The question hung in the air, and Eleanor felt the walls closing in around her. She knew the truth could destroy everything, but lying might only delay the inevitable. "I come from the country," she said carefully. "My family fell on hard times, and I sought work to support myself." "How noble," Abigail said, her smile sharp, "but surely a girl of your refinement has more to tell." The Duchess's gaze was piercing. "Ellen, if there is something you're hiding, now is the time to speak." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Panic rose within her, but before she could break, a familiar voice interrupted. "That's enough." All three women turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his expression thunderous. "She is under my protection," he said firmly, his gaze sweeping over the room. "If you have questions, you will direct them to me." Abigail's smile faltered, and the Duchess's expression turned to stone. Eleanor's heart raced as Alexander crossed the room, positioning himself between her and the others. For the first time, she felt the weight of his promise, and the danger it brought. The air in the parlor crackled with tension as Alexander positioned himself between Eleanor and the two women. His protective stance sent a clear message, one that neither Lady Abigail nor the Duchess could ignore. "Alexander?" the Duchess said, her tone measured but icy. "This is not a matter for you to intervene in. We are merely trying to ensure the integrity of this household." "I would think the integrity of this household rests on treating all within it with dignity," Alexander countered, his voice steady but firm. Abigail's lips pressed into a thin line. "Surely you must understand how this looks," she said, her voice honeyed but with an edge. A servant, mysteriously well-spoken and refined, drawing the Duke's attention. "People are bound to talk. They can talk all they wish," Alexander replied sharply, his gaze flickering to Eleanor. "But I will not have baseless accusations tarnish the reputation of someone who has done nothing to deserve it." Eleanor's breath caught at his words, a mix of gratitude and dread swirling within her. She wanted to sink into the floor, to escape the scrutiny and protect the fragile balance she had worked so hard to maintain. The Duchess rose gracefully from her seat, her expression unreadable. "Very well, Alexander. If you insist on vouching for her, we will let the matter rest. For now." Abigail's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, merely curtsying stiffly before following the Duchess out of the room. When the door closed behind them, the tension in the air seemed to ease, but only slightly. "You didn't have to do that," Eleanor said softly, breaking the silence. Alexander turned to her, his expression softening. "Of course I did. I won't stand by while you're cornered like that. But now they'll only dig deeper," she said, her voice trembling. "You've made it worse for both of us." He stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "Ellen, I know there's more to your story than you're letting on. But whatever it is, you're safe here. I'll make sure of it." Her resolve crumbled at his words, tears welling in her eyes. "You can't promise that," she whispered. "I can," he said firmly, taking her hand in his. "And I will." The confrontation in the parlor left Eleanor shaken. That evening, she retreated to her quarters, the weight of her secret pressing harder than ever. She knew she couldn't run forever, but the idea of revealing the truth to Alexander terrified her. As she sat by the small window in her room, staring out at the moonlit gardens, a memory surfaced, one she had tried so hard to bury. It had been over a year since her life had fallen apart. Eleanor wasn't her real name. She had taken it to escape the scandal that had engulfed her family. Her father, a respected but modest landowner, had been accused of embezzlement by a powerful nobleman. Though the charges were dubious, the fallout had been swift and merciless. Her family's estate was seized, her father imprisoned, and her mother left to fend for herself in a society that had turned its back on them. Eleanor, once a lady of standing, had been forced to disappear, knowing that her name alone would make her a target for ridicule and rejection. Westbridge Manor had been her sanctuary, a place where she could blend into the background and rebuild her life. But now, with Alexander's attention drawing her into the spotlight, the walls of her carefully constructed facade were beginning to crumble. Alexander couldn't sleep. The confrontation in the parlor replayed in his mind, along with Eleanor's haunted expression. He needed answers, not just to satisfy his curiosity, but to understand the pull she had on him. He found himself walking the halls late into the night, his steps eventually leading him to the garden. The moonlight cast a silver glow over the neatly trimmed hedges and flower beds, and it was there, by the fountain, that he saw her. Eleanor sat on the edge of the fountain, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. She looked up as he approached, her eyes widening in surprise. "Your Grace," she said, standing quickly. "Eleanor," he said, the use of her name deliberate. "I didn't mean to startle you. You shouldn't be out here," she said nervously, glancing around. "If someone sees us, I don't care who sees us," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. "I care about you." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, the weight of his words too much to bear. "Please don't say things like that," she whispered. "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because they're true? Or because you don't want to hear them?" She shook her head, her shoulders trembling. "Because it's dangerous, for both of us." "I don't care about the danger," he said, his voice softening. "I care about you, and I need to know what you're running from." Eleanor closed her eyes, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Try me," he urged, gently taking her hands in his. For a long moment she said nothing, the silence filled only by the soft trickle of the fountain. Then finally she spoke. "My name isn't Eleanor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Helena Ashford." Alexander's brow furrowed, the name triggering a vague memory. "Ashford, the family accused of embezzlement," she finished bitterly. "My father was framed, but it didn't matter. We lost everything. I lost everything." The weight of her confession hung between them, and Alexander's heart ached at the pain in her voice. He reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You didn't deserve that," he said gently. She laughed bitterly. Society didn't care. They labeled us guilty and moved on. "Well, society is often wrong," he said firmly. "And if you think I'll let them destroy you again, you're mistaken." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with equal parts hope and fear. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because I can't help myself," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the garden. Both of them turned, their hearts pounding, as Lady Abigail emerged from the shadows, her expression triumphant. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with mockery, "what a touching scene." The garden seemed to hold its breath as Lady Abigail stepped forward, her smile as sharp as the moonlight glinting off the fountain surface. She let her gaze drift between Alexander and Eleanor, savoring the tension she had interrupted. "This is quite the revelation," Abigail drawled, folding her arms, the Duke of Hawthorne and his mysterious servant sharing a clandestine moment. "What will the staff say?" Alexander's expression darkened. "If you have something to say, Abigail, say it plainly and be done with it." Abigail tilted her head, her eyes narrowing on Eleanor. "Oh, I think I've seen quite enough. It's no wonder you were so defensive earlier, Your Grace. Protecting her honor, was it? Or perhaps protecting her secrets?" Eleanor stepped back, her instinct to flee warring with the fire growing in her chest. "You know nothing about me," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Don't I?" Abigail countered, taking a step closer. "Your mannerisms, your speech, none of it aligns with the life of a common servant. And now you've just handed me the key to unraveling it all. Helena Ashford, is it?" Eleanor's blood ran cold at the sound of her true name on Abigail's lips. "That name carries weight," Abigail continued, her smile tightening. "A scandal that shook society. a family disgraced, and now one of its fallen daughters hiding under this very roof. Oh, how deliciously ironic. Enough, Alexander said sharply, stepping between them. If you think I'll stand by while you attempt to humiliate her, you are sorely mistaken. Abigail's eyes flashed with anger. And what will you do, Alexander? Defend her to the taunt, risk your reputation, your family's legacy for this fugitive? I'll do whatever I must, he said, his voice low and dangerous. But make no mistake, Abigail, if you so much as breathe a word of this outside these walls, you will regret it. For a moment, Abigail's bravado faltered, but she recovered quickly, her lips curving into a smug smile. You can't silence the truth, Alexander. And the truth is, this girl doesn't belong here. She doesn't belong with you. With a final pointed glance at Eleanor, Abigail turned and swept back toward the manor, her footsteps echoing in the still night. Eleanor's knees buckled as soon as Abigail was out of sight. She sank onto the edge of the fountain, her hands trembling. This is the end, she whispered, her voice hollow. She'll tell everyone. I'll be ruined. You'll be ruined. Alexander knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. Look at me, Eleanor, Helena. Look at me. She raised her tear-filled eyes to meet his. No one is ruining you, he said firmly. Not Abigail. Not society. No one. You don't understand, she said, shaking her head. Once my name is known, they'll come for me. I'll be cast out or worse, arrested. Then we'll face it together, he said without hesitation. Her breath hitched at his words. Why? Why would you do that for me? Because I care for you, he said softly. Because I see you for who you are. Not the name they tried to tarnish, but the woman standing in front of me. And I will not let you face this alone. Abigail wasted no time after leaving the garden. She returned to her chambers and immediately summoned her maid, instructing her to fetch ink and parchment. She began drafting a letter, her pen moving swiftly across the page. To Lady Penelope Barrington, it is with the utmost concern that I write to you regarding a matter of grave importance. You may recall the Ashford scandal, such a shocking tale of deceit and betrayal. Imagine my surprise to discover one of its central figures residing under the roof of Westbridge Manor, posing as a servant no less. She paused, tapping the pen against her lip. The letter would have to be perfect. A scandal like this required the right audience, someone who could fan the flames while keeping Abigail's own hands clean. She smiled as she sealed the letter. By the end of the week, the entire ton would know of Helena Ashford's whereabouts, and with that, Abigail would rid herself of her competition for good. Alexander wasn't naive to Abigail's intentions. He knew she wouldn't rest until she had exposed Eleanor, or worse. That night, he called for his most trusted advisor, Thomas Harrow, a longtime friend who had helped him navigate countless political and social intrigues. Thomas, Alexander began, pacing his study. I need you to look into someone discreetly. Abigail Hawthorne. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Your cousin? Why? She's planning something, and I need to know what it is before she can act on it. Thomas nodded. And the girl? Ellen, as she's known? Alexander hesitated. Her name is Helena Ashford. Thomas's eyes widened. The Ashford scandal? That's quite a revelation. It doesn't matter, Alexander said firmly. She's under my protection, and I won't let anyone harm her. Do whatever it takes to ensure that Abigail's schemes are stopped before they can do any damage. Thomas gave a short nod. Consider it done. The days that followed were tense. Eleanor kept to herself, her heart heavy with the weight of her secret. She avoided the Duke as much as possible, fearing that any interaction between them would only fuel Abigail's vendetta. But Alexander was never far from her thoughts. His words, his unwavering support, lingered in her mind like a beacon in the darkness. She found herself in the library one evening, seeking solace among the dusty tomes. As she ran her fingers along the spines, a familiar voice broke the silence. Are you hiding from me again? She turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and a small smile tugging at his lips. I thought it best, she admitted, her voice soft. He stepped closer, his expression turning serious. You don't have to hide, Helena. Not from me, not from anyone. She looked away. "It's not that simple." "Then let me make it simple," he said, taking her hand. "Stay. Stay here, with me. Let me fight for you." Her heart ached at his words. She wanted to believe him, to trust in the sanctuary he offered. But the shadows of her past loomed large, and she knew they wouldn't disappear so easily. "I don't deserve your kindness," she whispered. "And I don't deserve to lose you," he replied. Their gazes locked, the unspoken connection between them stronger than ever. Eleanor spent the next few days in a constant state of vigilance. The oppressive fear of discovery hung over her like a storm cloud, but Alexander's words echoed in her mind. "Stay. Let me fight for you." His unwavering support gave her a fragile sense of hope, but she knew it wouldn't last if Abigail succeeded in her scheme. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, the wheels of Abigail's plan were already in motion. The letter she had sent to Lady Penelope Barrington had reached its destination, and the sharp-tongued gossip wasted no time sharing the contents with her wide circle of acquaintances. The whispers began as a trickle, but they soon swelled into a torrent. The name Eleanor Ashford was on everyone's lips, and the scandal was rekindled with fresh vigor. Alexander's trusted friend, Thomas Harrow, worked quickly to uncover Abigail's intentions. It didn't take long for him to find the trail. Abigail's sudden request for a courier and her subsequent correspondence with Lady Penelope raised immediate suspicion. Thomas intercepted a copy of the letter with the help of one of his discreet contacts in the Hawthorne estate. As he read the damning words, his jaw tightened. Abigail wasn't just trying to expose Eleanor, she was weaving a web of lies to ensure that Eleanor would be forced to leave the estate, or worse, face legal consequences. He returned to Westbridge Manor with the letter in hand, finding Alexander in the study. "Alexander," Thomas said grimly, handing over the letter. Alexander's face darkened as he read the contents. "She's more brazen than I thought," he muttered, slamming the letter onto the desk. "This will spread fast," Thomas warned, "if it hasn't already." "Then we'll need to act faster," Alexander said, his mind racing. "We need to discredit Abigail before she can do any more damage." Thomas hesitated. "That won't be easy. She's a Hawthorne. People will take her word over anyone else's, especially over Helena's." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Then we need to find proof that Abigail is lying, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect her." That evening, Alexander found Eleanor in the small garden she often visited for solitude. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary. "Your Grace," she said softly, rising to her feet. "We need to talk," he said, his tone firm but gentle. Eleanor frowned, sensing the tension in his voice. "What is it?" "Abigail has sent word to Lady Penelope Barrington," he said, watching her reaction closely. "She's told her everything, or at least, her version of the truth." Eleanor's face paled, and she gripped the edge of the stone bench for support. "Then it's over," she whispered. "No," Alexander said quickly, stepping closer. "It's not over. I won't let it be. But if the Ton knows, they'll only know what Abigail wants them to believe," he interrupted. "But we can fight back. We can prove her wrong." She shook her head. "How? How can we fight a name as powerful as Hawthorne?" "With the truth," he said simply. "But I need you to trust me, Helena. I need you to tell me everything." Eleanor hesitated, her heart pounding. She had kept her secrets for so long, guarding them like precious shards of glass. But now, as she looked into Alexander's eyes, she saw something she hadn't felt in years: hope. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "My father, Edward Ashford, was a landowner," she began. "Not wealthy, but respectable. He worked hard to provide for our family, and for a time we were happy." Alexander listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. "But then Lord Radcliffe came into our lives," she continued, her voice trembling. "He was a powerful nobleman, and he approached my father with a business proposition, a partnership that promised great returns." She paused, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. "My father trusted him. He invested everything we had into Radcliffe's scheme, believing it would secure our future. But it was all a lie. Radcliffe used my father as a scapegoat for his own embezzlement. When the truth came out, Radcliffe walked away unscathed, and my father. He was arrested. Alexander's fists clenched at her words. And Radcliffe is still free? Yes, she said bitterly. He's too powerful, too well connected. No one dared to challenge him. And with my father imprisoned, my family was left to face the consequences. We lost everything, our home, our reputation. My mother, she didn't survive the shame. Her voice broke, and Alexander reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I had no choice but to flee, she said, her tears falling freely now. I couldn't stay and face the scorn that whispered. I became Eleanor, a servant, just to survive. Alexander's heart ached at her story, but it also filled him with determination. You've suffered enough, he said firmly, and I'll make sure Radcliffe answers for what he's done. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes wide with both fear and gratitude. But how? Leave that to me, he said. For now, you need to trust me. Stay by my side, and we'll face this together. The next morning, Thomas returned with new information that could turn the tide. He had uncovered several of Abigail's past indiscretions, gambling debts, falsified accounts, and a secret affair with a married nobleman. It's not enough to ruin her outright, Thomas said, but it's enough to cast doubt on her credibility. Alexander nodded. Then we use it. If she wants to play this game, we'll play it better. The morning sun filtered through the manor's expansive windows, casting light on a household simmering with tension. Alexander had made his decision. It was time to confront Abigail, to force her hand before her web of deceit could fully entangle Eleanor. He found Abigail in the drawing room, sipping tea as though she hadn't recently set a scandal in motion. She looked up, feigning surprise as he entered. Alexander, she said smoothly, what a pleasure. To what do I owe this visit? We need to talk, he said bluntly, crossing the room. He didn't bother to sit, towering over her like a storm cloud. Abigail raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smile. Such intensity so early in the day. Have I done something to displease you? Enough with the games, Abigail, Alexander said sharply. I know what you've done. She set her teacup down with deliberate grace, her expression carefully neutral. You'll have to be more specific. He pulled the intercepted letter from his coat pocket and placed it on the table between them. Your words, sent to Lady Penelope. A calculated attack on someone under my protection. Abigail's gaze flicked to the letter, then back to him. So you've been snooping. How unbecoming of a duke. Spare me your deflections, he said coldly. You've overstepped, Abigail, and I won't stand for it. Her calm facade began to crack, a flicker of anger appearing in her eyes. Overstepped? I merely informed a friend of the truth. That girl, that woman, Alexander interrupted, his voice like steel, has done nothing to deserve your malice. And if you think I'll let you destroy her to serve your petty jealousy, you're mistaken. Abigail stood, her composure slipping entirely. Petty jealousy? You think this is about jealousy? She's a fraud, Alexander. A ruined woman posing as a servant, daring to steal your affections. And what of your frauds, Abigail? He countered, his voice rising. Your gambling debts, your lies to cover them? Or shall I mention your indiscretions with Lord Chamberlain? Abigail's face turned crimson, her fury barely contained. You wouldn't dare. Oh, I would, Alexander said, his tone deadly. One word from me, and the entire ton will know exactly who you are. So, here's what you'll do. You'll retract your claims. You'll tell Lady Penelope you were mistaken, and you'll leave Eleanor Helena alone. Abigail glared at him, her hands trembling with rage. You think you've won, don't you? Protect her all you like, Alexander, but you can't shield her from the truth forever. The Tom will find out, and when they do, you'll be the one ruined. Then so be it, he said, his voice unwavering. I would rather face ruin than betray my honor, or her. Eleanor sat in the manor's library, the book in her hands unread as her mind raced. She had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by the looming threat of Abigail's schemes. She knew Alexander was fighting for her, but how much longer could he protect her before the truth became too much to bear? The sound of the door opening startled her. She looked up to see Alexander, his expression both determined and weary. Your Grace, she said, rising to her feet, is everything? "It's handled," he said, cutting her off. "Abigail won't trouble you again." She blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean? What did you do?" "I gave her a choice," he said simply. "And let's just say she chose wisely." Eleanor's chest tightened. "You've put yourself at risk for me. If the Ton finds out about my past—" "Let them," Alexander said, stepping closer. "Let them talk. Let them judge. I don't care." "You should care," she said, her voice breaking. "Your reputation, your family's legacy, it means everything to them. It means nothing to me without you," he said, his voice softening. "Eleanor, Helena, you are what matters." She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "I don't deserve you." "Yes, you do," he said, lifting a hand to gently brush a tear from her cheek. "You deserve love, happiness, a life free from fear, and I will give you that, no matter the cost." Meanwhile, Thomas continued his investigation into Lord Radcliffe, determined to bring the man to justice. His inquiries led him to a series of financial records that hinted at Radcliffe's involvement in fraudulent schemes. Thomas returned to Alexander with his findings. "This is enough to raise questions," he said. "If we can expose Radcliffe, it might clear Helena's name." Alexander nodded. "Then that's our next move." "What about the Ton?" Thomas asked. "They'll still talk. Let them," Alexander said, echoing his earlier sentiment. "The truth will speak louder than their gossip." Abigail, humiliated and cornered, made her retreat from Westbridge Manor under the guise of visiting family in Bath. But her departure did little to quell the gossip she had already stirred. Whispers of Helena Ashford circulated through the Ton, casting a shadow over Alexander and Eleanor's fragile peace. Yet, for the first time, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope. With Alexander by her side, she dared to believe that she might overcome the storm, and perhaps even find happiness. The grand ballroom of Lord Chesterfield's manor glittered with opulence. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, and the polished marble floors gleamed beneath the soft shuffle of silk shoes and the rustle of expensive gowns. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and intrigue, a perfect backdrop for London's elite to indulge in gossip, games, and scandal. Eleanor stood near the edge of the room, her hands tightly clasped around a delicate glass of champagne. She felt the weight of every gaze, every hushed whisper. The rumor of Helena Ashford had spread like wildfire. It was only a matter of time before someone connected her to the mysterious servant living under the Duke of Hawthorne's protection. Beside her, Alexander stood tall and resolute, his presence a comforting shield. He had insisted she accompany him tonight, despite her reluctance. "We face them together," he had said. But now, standing in the lion's den, Eleanor wasn't so sure she could endure it. A sudden hush fell over the room as a new arrival entered, the imposing figure of Lord Radcliffe. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that demanded attention, Radcliffe commanded respect even as a murmur of unease rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's grip on her glass tightened, her knuckles white. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alexander followed her gaze, his expression hardening. Tonight, the hunter becomes the hunted. As Radcliffe mingled, his eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Eleanor before moving on. There was no recognition in his gaze, but the very sight of him sent shivers down her spine. Alexander leaned in, his voice low. "Stay close to me. If he approaches, we'll be ready." Before Eleanor could respond, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "Your Grace, a word." Lady Penelope Barrington, resplendent in a deep emerald gown, stood before them. Her eyes gleamed with curiosity, and something else, something sharper. "Lady Penelope," Alexander greeted, his tone carefully neutral. "What can I do for you?" She glanced at Eleanor, her smile tight. "Rumor has it you've taken a particular interest in your new servant. Quite the scandal, isn't it?" Alexander's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, Eleanor spoke. "It's not a scandal if there's nothing to hide, Lady Penelope." The older woman's eyes widened, momentarily taken aback by Eleanor's composed defiance. Then, a slow smile spread across her face. "Interesting. Very interesting." Alexander stepped forward, his voice firm. "Lady Penelope, I suggest you tread carefully. Gossip is a dangerous weapon, especially when aimed at the wrong target. Penelope's eyes flashed. "Are you threatening me, Your Grace?" "Merely advising caution," he replied smoothly. "Now, if you'll excuse us." As they walked away, Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "That was bold," Alexander smiled. "It needed to be done. These people feed on fear, show them strength, and they falter." Across the room, Radcliffe watched them with a predator's interest. He recognized something in the young woman, an echo of the past, a ghost he couldn't quite place. But he dismissed the thought. There were always new faces in the ton, new scandals to exploit. Yet, as the evening progressed, his unease grew. He noticed the way the Duke of Hawthorne kept a protective hand near her, the way she glanced his way and quickly looked away. Memory stirred, a courtroom, a broken man, a scandal swept under the rug. He needed answers. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander guided Eleanor toward the terrace, hoping to escape the suffocating atmosphere. But before they could reach the door, a voice stopped them. "Your Grace, leaving so soon?" They turned to find Radcliffe standing in their path, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. Alexander's hand tightened around Eleanor's. "Lord Radcliffe, I didn't expect to see you tonight." Radcliffe's smile was thin and predatory. "And I didn't expect to see you here." His gaze flicked to Eleanor. "Your companion is familiar." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I doubt that, my lord. We've never met." "Haven't we?" Radcliffe's eyes narrowed. "Strange. You remind me of someone from a long time ago." Alexander stepped between them, his voice like ice. "Careful, Radcliffe." Radcliffe's smile widened. "Ah, so protective. I wonder why." Eleanor could feel the tension crackling between them, the air thick with unspoken threats. She knew this was only the beginning, that Radcliffe would not rest until he uncovered the truth. And when he did, everything would change. Later that night, back at Westbridge Manor, Alexander and Thomas reviewed the evidence they had gathered against Radcliffe. Financial records, false partnerships, accounts of betrayal. Enough to cast doubt on Radcliffe's spotless reputation. "We need to make this public," Thomas said. "Expose him before he can act." Alexander nodded. "We'll present it to the magistrate. But we need a witness, someone who can tie it all together." Eleanor stepped forward, her expression resolute. "I'll testify. I'll tell them everything." Alexander's eyes met hers, filled with both pride and concern. "Are you sure? It won't be easy." She took a deep breath. "I'm sure. It's time to end this." The day of reckoning dawned heavy with anticipation. Gray clouds blanketed the sky, mirroring the weight of the secret Eleanor was preparing to expose. She stood in the drawing room of Westbridge Manor, dressed in a simple yet elegant gown, her hands trembling slightly. In a few hours they would confront Lord Radcliffe publicly, a gamble that could destroy them or set her free. Alexander approached her, his expression a mix of determination and concern. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "We can find another way." Eleanor shook her head. "This is the only way. I've been running from my past for too long. It's time to face it." Her eyes met his. "You've given me the strength to do this." Alexander's gaze softened. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "No matter what happens, I will be by your side." A knock at the door interrupted their moment. Thomas entered, a folder of documents in his hand. "The carriage is ready," he said. "The magistrate is expecting us." Eleanor nodded, taking a deep breath. "Then let's end this." The courtroom buzzed with hushed conversations, the air thick with tension. London's elite had gathered, drawn by the scent of scandal. Lord Radcliffe sat at the defendant's table, his expression a mask of calm indifference. But his eyes flickered with something deeper, concern, perhaps even fear. Eleanor sat beside Alexander, her heart pounding. She felt the weight of every gaze upon her, the whisper of every accusation. Ruined woman, scandalous past, pretender. The magistrate, a stern-looking man with piercing eyes, called the room to order. "We are here today to address serious accusations against Lord Radcliffe. The evidence presented will determine the course of justice." Thomas stood first, presenting the financial records and witness statements they had gathered. He spoke with precision, each word cutting through the courtroom's tension like a blade. These documents prove that Lord Radcliffe orchestrated a series of fraudulent investments, using innocent men like Edward Ashford as scapegoats. Radcliffe's lawyer rose, his voice smooth and confident. These allegations are baseless. My client is a respected member of society. This is nothing more than an attempt to tarnish his reputation. The magistrate turned to Eleanor. Helena Ashford, please take the stand. She stood, her legs trembling as she walked to the witness box. The room fell silent as she faced the magistrate, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. My father trusted Lord Radcliffe. He invested everything we had into what he believed was a legitimate partnership. When the scheme fell apart, Radcliffe let my father take the blame. Radcliffe's lawyer smirked. And we're to believe this sob story? A servant masquerading as nobility? Alexander's voice cut through the room. You will show respect, he growled, his tone leaving no room for argument. The lawyer swallowed, nodding. Apologies, Your Grace, but we need more than the word of a woman with a questionable past. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. My past does not change the truth. My father was innocent, and I will not let his name be dragged through the mud any longer. Radcliffe stood abruptly, his calm facade cracking. This is absurd. A woman like her. Silence! The magistrate thundered. He turned to Thomas. Is there any further evidence? Thomas nodded. We have a witness, one who was part of Radcliffe's inner circle during the scandal. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a man stepped inside. Gasps echoed through the room as he approached the stand. It was a former associate of Radcliffe's, a man who had disappeared years ago, presumed dead. Radcliffe's face went pale. The man spoke, his voice rough with years of silence. Radcliffe orchestrated everything. He used Ashford to cover his tracks. I was there. I saw it all. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Radcliffe shouted, his composure completely gone. Lies, all of it. But the magistrate's gavel silenced him. Order! He turned to Radcliffe, his eyes cold. The evidence is clear. You are hereby placed under arrest, pending further investigation. Radcliffe's eyes met Eleanor's, filled with fury and something else, defeat. The courtroom emptied slowly, the murmur of scandal and justice lingering in the air. Eleanor stood outside, the cold wind biting at her cheeks. She felt free. For the first time in years, the weight of her past had lifted. Alexander joined her, his eyes searching hers. It's over. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you, for everything. He took her hands in his gaze intense. You were the brave one, Eleanor. You faced your past and won. She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. What now? He cupped her face gently. Now, we start again, together. She leaned into him, the warmth of his embrace chasing away the chill. I'd like that. As they stood there, the future stretched before them, uncertain, but full of promise. And for the first time in years, Eleanor believed she could face it. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the gardens of Westbridge Manor. Roses bloomed in vibrant colors, their sweet fragrance drifting on the soft breeze. Birds sang in the distance, their melodies weaving through the tranquility of the evening. The world felt softer, lighter, as though it too sensed the end of a long-fought battle. Eleanor stood by the fountain, the delicate fabric of her gown swaying gently in the breeze. She looked up at the sky, a soft smile playing on her lips. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. The shadows of her past had lifted, and in their place was something she hadn't dared hope for, love, and a future she could choose for herself. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Alexander. She could feel his presence, strong and steady, like a heartbeat in the silence. You've been quiet, he said, his voice low and tender. Are you all right? She turned to face him, her eyes shining. More than all right. I'm happy. The word felt unfamiliar, yet perfectly right. Alexander stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. You deserve every happiness, Eleanor. You fought so hard for this moment. She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. I couldn't have done it without you. He reached up, gently brushing the tear away with his thumb. His touch lingered, sending a shiver down her spine. You've given me something I never thought I'd have, a reason to hope, to love. She placed her hand over his, her voice soft. I thought I would never trust again. But you've shown me what it means to truly live. His gaze deepened, the intensity of his emotions reflected in the stormy blue of his eyes. I love you, Eleanor. Not because of your past, but because of who you are. Strong, brave, and utterly extraordinary. Tears welled in her eyes, her heart overflowing. I love you too, Alexander. With all my heart. He cupped her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. Slowly, he leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. Their lips met in a kiss, soft and tender at first, then deepening into something more passionate, more desperate. It was a kiss that spoke of promises made, of futures intertwined, of a love that had weathered every storm. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She rested her forehead against his, her eyes still closed, savoring the moment. Alexander's voice was a whisper. Marry me. She opened her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. What? He smiled, his eyes full of warmth. Marry me, Eleanor, be my duchess, share your life with me. Her heart pounded in her chest. Yes, she breathed. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her again, a soft, lingering kiss that sealed their promise. The world around them seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them, wrapped in each other's arms. As the sun set over the gardens, Alexander held Eleanor close, their hearts beating in perfect harmony. The past was behind them, and the future stretched out before them, a future filled with love, laughter, and endless possibilities. In that moment, nothing else mattered. They had found each other, and in each other, they had found home. Hey everyone! If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means a lot and helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.